She confiscated my 6-year-old's flamingo pool float at the community pool gate, in front of at least 15 other families, holding it up like evidence at a trial, and announcing that excessively vibrant inflatables violated the community's aesthetic use policy, while my daughter stood there in her swimsuit, confused and starting to cry. And I want to tell you that I have never in my life gone from zero to genuinely furious as fast as I did in that exact moment. What I did not know yet, standing at that pool gate holding my sobbing daughter's hand, was that the same woman who had just declared a pink flamingo float a threat to community aesthetics was, at that very moment, running an unlicensed short-term rental business out of her own backyard pool, in direct violation of both HOA rules and county ordinance, and had been for well over a year. My name is Odalise Ferrerakim. I live in Bramblewood Commons, a community of about 200 homes with a shared amenity pool that's honestly one of the main reasons my husband Teodoro and I chose this neighborhood 5 years ago, specifically because it meant our kids, Camilla and little Mateo, could spend their summers somewhere close and supervised rather than us driving across town to a public facility every time they wanted to swim. The woman who confiscated Camilla's flamingo float, a bright, ridiculous, completely ordinary pool toy that half the kids at that pool own some version of, was Bernadette Wexler-Holt, who had been president of the Bramblewood Commons board for a little over a year at that point. Bernadette had run for the position on what she described at the candidate forum the previous spring as a commitment to elevating the visual sophistication of the community's shared spaces, language that struck me at the time as vague but harmless, the kind of thing HOA candidates say without necessarily meaning anything specific by it. I understood, standing at that pool gate watching her confiscate my daughter's float, exactly how specific she had actually meant it. The community pool rules, as they'd existed for the entire 5 years we'd lived there, included a fairly standard restriction on large flotation devices during busy hours meant to prevent giant inflatable rafts from monopolizing the pool space when it was crowded, a rule that made perfect sense and that I'd never had any issue with. What Bernadette had apparently done, without any formal vote or community notification that I was ever made aware of, was begin unilaterally enforcing a much broader, entirely new standard about aesthetic appropriateness of pool toys generally, one that, as far as I could tell from the confused reactions of the other families standing around that afternoon, existed nowhere in any actual written policy and seemed to be based entirely on Bernadette's own personal taste in what she considered visually tasteful versus what she considered gaudy. I asked her as calmly as I could manage while comforting a crying 6-year-old to show me the specific written policy she was enforcing. She told me, with the particular clipped confidence of someone who has never once been meaningfully challenged, that the policy fell under the board's general discretionary authority over shared amenity aesthetics, and that she didn't need to produce a specific document to enforce what she called obvious common sense standards. I want to tell you that I let this go, calmed down, and moved on with my day. I did not. I spent the rest of that afternoon, once Camilla had settled down with a considerably less colorful but functionally identical replacement float I'd grabbed from our car, quietly asking other families at the pool whether they'd experienced anything similar, and the answers I got over the following hour told me this was not an isolated incident at all. A father named Desmond Achterberg told me Bernadette had confiscated his son's bright orange arm floats the previous week, citing the same vague, aesthetic language. A mother named Rosalind Nkemelu told me her daughter's rainbow-striped pool noodle had been taken just 2 days earlier. Nobody had filed a formal complaint, mostly, as far as I could tell, because each family had assumed this was an isolated overreaction to their specific item rather than part of a pattern, and because confronting an HOA board president over a pool float felt, to most reasonable people, like an absurdly petty thing to escalate. But 5 separate confiscations in under 2 weeks, all citing the same undocumented policy, all enforced personally by Bernadette herself rather than through any formal written notice process, was not a series of isolated incidents. It was a pattern, and once I started actually paying attention to it, I noticed something else too, something that took me a little longer to piece together, but that ended up mattering enormously once I did. Every single confiscated item, without exception, had been something bright, colorful, patterned, the kind of ordinary, cheerful pool toy that most families with young kids own several of. Meanwhile, over that same 2-week period, I started noticing that Bernadette herself had begun bringing an increasingly elaborate collection of pool furniture and decor to the community pool for what she described as demonstration purposes. Sleek, monochromatic lounges and neutral-toned umbrellas that she'd apparently be willing to loan out or recommend to anyone interested in elevating their own aesthetic. A phrase that struck me as an odd thing for an HOA president to be personally promoting during pool hours. I mentioned this observation to my neighbor and closest friend in the community, a woman named Priyanka Delacroix Boyd, who happens to run a small interior styling business on the side and has a sharper eye than almost anyone I know for exactly this kind of thing. Priyanka's response, when I described what I'd been noticing, was immediate and pointed. "Odalisque," she said, "that sounds less like an aesthetic preference and more like a business trying to build a very specific brand image. Has anyone checked whether she's doing something with her own backyard pool?" I hadn't thought to check, honestly, because it hadn't occurred to me that any of this might connect to something happening entirely outside the community amenity pool at all. But Priyanka's question stuck with me, and that same evening, out of simple curiosity more than any real expectation of finding anything, I did a search for Bernadette's address on a popular short-term rental and event space booking platform, the kind people use to rent out backyards, pools, and party spaces by the hour for events like birthday parties, bridal showers, and small gatherings. I found it within about 2 minutes. The listing, titled Serene Retreat Poolside Oasis, featured professional photographs of a backyard pool that I recognized immediately, the same distinctive curved shape, the same stone patio edging, the same pergola structure I'd glimpsed once or twice driving past Bernadette's house. The listing described the space as available for private rental by the hour, with pricing starting at $85 for a 2-hour minimum booking, additional fees for parties over 10 guests, and notably, a section of house rules explicitly requesting that guests bring only tasteful, neutral-toned pool accessories to maintain the space's aesthetic, a detail that, once I read it, made the entire flamingo float confiscation suddenly make a very different kind of sense. Bernadette Wexler-Holt was not enforcing an aesthetic policy for the benefit of the Bramblewood Commons community pool. She had at some point developed a private commercial rental business out of her own backyard pool, apparently built around a very specific visual brand, and appeared to be using her position as HOA president to informally train the community's residents through selective, undocumented enforcement of confiscations at the shared amenity pool toward exactly the kind of neutral, minimalist aesthetic she was separately marketing to paying strangers. Whether that connection was fully conscious on her part or not. I called Priyanka back that same night and read her the listing in full. There was a long pause on the line before she said, "Odalisque, I don't even think the aesthetic thing is the real problem here. Read me the listing address again. Is that inside Bramblewood Commons?" I checked, it was. Which meant, if this listing was accurate and active, Bernadette was operating a paid commercial event rental business out of a residential lot inside a community whose own governing declaration, like nearly every HOA declaration I'd ever heard of, almost certainly prohibited exactly that kind of commercial activity, the same category of restriction. I would later learn from a friend who dealt with something structurally similar involving a food truck dispute in an entirely different neighborhood, that HOAs love to selectively enforce against ordinary homeowners, while somehow never noticing when a board member does something considerably more brazen right under everyone's nose. I pulled our own governing declaration that same night, the same way I imagine most people in these situations eventually do once they realize the fight has moved beyond a simple misunderstanding, and found the commercial activity restriction almost immediately, language prohibiting the operation of any business, rental enterprise, or paid event hosting service from any residential lot within the community. There was no ambiguity in it at all, none of the decades-old vague language complications I'd heard other people run into with their own older declarations. Bramblewood Commons's declaration had been updated relatively recently, only about 6 years earlier, specifically, according to a footnote I found referencing the amendment history, to address exactly this kind of short-term rental and event hosting activity that had become increasingly common nationally. Bernadette, in other words, was not just overreaching on pool float aesthetics through undocumented personal discretion. She was, as far as I could tell from a single evening of research, actively and knowingly violating the exact commercial activity restriction that she herself, as board president, was nominally responsible for enforcing against everyone else. I want to walk you through what I did next, because I think it matters, especially given how petty the original confiscation had felt just days earlier. I did not march over to her house and confront her directly. I did not post anything publicly yet. Instead, I called Priyanka, and together we spent the following week doing exactly the kind of careful, methodical documentation that I'd need to make sure this couldn't simply be explained away or quietly buried once Bernadette realized someone had noticed. We took screenshots of the listing, the pricing, the house rules, and critically, the reviews, several of which specifically referenced hosting parties on dates that, when I cross-referenced them against the community pool's own posted maintenance closure schedule that Bernadette herself had circulated as board president, lined up suspiciously well with weekends, the shared amenity pool had been marked closed for routine maintenance. A pattern that felt uncomfortably familiar the moment I noticed it, and that made me wonder, with a growing sense of unease, just how long this had actually been going on, and how many of those supposed maintenance closures had really just been Bernadette clearing the community calendar to avoid any awkward questions about why her own backyard pool, 3 streets over, happened to be fully booked with strangers on the exact same weekend. That's where part 2 picks up, because what Priyanka and I found in that maintenance closure pattern, once we actually laid it all out side by side, went back considerably further than either of us expected. And it's the reason this story ends with Bernadette Wexler-Holt standing in front of the entire Bramblewood Commons membership. Unable to explain why a woman so devoted to aesthetic standards had spent over a year breaking the exact rule she was supposed to be the community's most trusted enforcer of. The maintenance closure pattern Priyanka and I pieced together once we sat down with a full year of Bernadette's own newsletter archives and cross-referenced every posted closure date against the rental listings review history, turned out to go back over 16 months, considerably longer than either of us had guessed when we first started looking. We counted 9 separate weekends where the community amenity pool had been closed for reasons ranging from routine chemical balancing to scheduled equipment inspection, every single one of which matched, within a day, a 5-star review on Bernadette's rental listing describing a party, shower, or gathering hosted at Serene Retreat Poolside Oasis. 9 weekends, at an average rental price, we calculated conservatively at around $220 per booking, once you factored in the additional guest fees most reviews mentioned, came out to just under $2,000 in documented revenue, though both of us suspected, given how far back the listing itself appeared to date, that the true total across the full 16 months was considerably higher than what we could confirm just from the community pool's own closure schedule. We also found something else, buried in an old newsletter from about 4 months into Bernadette's presidency, that added an uncomfortable new dimension to the aesthetic policy she'd been enforcing at the community pool. In that newsletter, announcing what she called a community amenity refresh initiative, Bernadette had specifically encouraged residents to consider replacing outdated or visually inconsistent pool accessories with more cohesive, elevated alternatives, and had, in a section I nearly missed on my first read-through, included a small note suggesting interested residents reach out to her directly for styling recommendations, a phrase that, once I understood what her rental business actually looked like, read less like harmless community spirit and more like a quiet, informal pipeline steering neighbors toward exactly the aesthetic she was separately building a commercial brand around. I brought everything Priyanka, and I had compiled to a woman I'd gotten to know a little over the years through the community's book club, Farah Ose Whitlock, who happened to be a real estate attorney with specific experience in HOA commercial activity disputes, a specialty that, much like in a couple of similar situations I later heard about from friends dealing with their own HOA messes, turned out to be exactly what this case needed. Farah reviewed the listing screenshots, the closure pattern, and our declaration's commercial activity clause, and told us within our first meeting that this was, in her professional opinion, an unusually clean case. The declaration language is unambiguous, she said. No business, rental enterprise, or paid event hosting from a residential lot, full stop, no carve-outs. She's not just technically in violation, she's been actively structuring her closures at the community pool to avoid scrutiny while running this, which suggests she understood perfectly well that what she was doing wasn't allowed. And frankly, the pool float enforcement pattern, while it seems petty on its own, actually strengthens the broader picture here, because it shows someone using her board authority in a way that appears to serve her private commercial interests rather than any genuine community standard. Farah also flagged something we hadn't fully considered on our own, that a short-term rental business hosting paid gatherings around a private pool almost certainly required specific liability insurance, and depending on our county's specific regulations, potentially a business license and short-term rental permit that a residential property wouldn't typically carry. A quick records check with the county confirmed exactly what Farah suspected. Bernadette's property held no short-term rental permit, no commercial event hosting license, and her homeowner's insurance policy, according to a public liability filing Farah was able to access, remained registered under a standard residential use category, meaning any injury occurring during one of her paid rentals would likely not have been covered at all. A genuinely serious liability exposure, not just for Bernadette herself, but potentially for any guest injured at one of these unlicensed, uninsured gatherings. We decided, after talking it through with Farah, that this needed to go to the full community rather than being handled as a quiet private dispute between me and Bernadette, partly because of the sheer number of families who'd been affected by the aesthetic pool toy enforcement, and partly because Farah felt strongly that a matter involving genuine liability exposure for the community deserved full transparency rather than a backroom resolution that might let Bernadette simply continue quietly. The special meeting Farah helped us formally request, gathering signatures from concerned homeowners far more easily than I expected once word started spreading about the confiscated pool floats, was held about 3 weeks later in the Bramblewood Commons clubhouse, and I want to tell you that room filled up faster than I'd ever seen it, partly because of genuine outrage over the aesthetic pool toy enforcement, which had, by that point, expanded to include at least 2 more confiscations I hadn't even known about, and partly, I think, out of simple curiosity once rumors started circulating that the meeting involved something considerably bigger than pool floats. I presented the case myself, with Priyanka and Farah both there for support, walking the room through the flamingo float confiscation, the pattern of similar confiscations affecting at least 7 different families, and then, methodically, the rental listing, the pricing, the reviews, and the maintenance closure pattern lined up side by side on a projector screen Farah had helped us prepare in advance. I watched the room's reaction shift in real time, the same kind of collective, stunned silence I'd heard about from friends who'd gone through similar confrontations with their own HOA boards. Dozens of families who had, without realizing it, been quietly nudged toward Bernadette's preferred aesthetic, while she profited privately off a business built on exactly that image, all while their kids' ordinary, colorful pool toys were being confiscated at the gate under the guise of community standards. Bernadette, given the opportunity to respond, initially tried to characterize the rental listing as a small personal project that she didn't consider relevant to her HOA role, an explanation that fell apart almost immediately once Farah pointed out the direct overlap between the community pool's closure schedule and the rental's booking dates, a pattern that, as Farah put it plainly to the room, was very difficult to explain away as coincidence, occurring 9 separate times over 16 months. A father near the front, one of the several parents whose kids had lost pool toys to Bernadette's enforcement, asked the question that seemed to finally break through whatever composure she had left. "So you took my son's floats because they didn't match your brand," he said, "while you were breaking the exact rule you're supposed to enforce and closing our pool so people wouldn't notice." Bernadette did not have an answer for that, and the room, much like other similar confrontations I've since heard about from people dealing with their own overreaching HOA presidents, did not wait politely for one. The vote to remove her from the board that night was overwhelming, passed by voice vote with only a handful of abstentions, and the community additionally authorized Farah to pursue formal legal action seeking repayment of any misused community funds tied to the falsified maintenance closures, along with a referral to the county regarding the unlicensed, uninsured commercial rental operation itself. The legal resolution took about 3 months to fully settle, facing the county referral, which quickly revealed that operating an unlicensed short-term event rental business did in fact violate both zoning and business licensing requirements independent of anything in our HOA declaration, and facing Farah's civil claim regarding the falsified maintenance closures, Bernadette agreed to a settlement that included ceasing all rental operations immediately, paying a fine to the county for the unlicensed business activity, and reimbursing the HOA a modest sum reflecting the value of pool access residents had effectively been denied during those 9 falsified closure weekends. She resigned from the board formally as part of that settlement and put her house on the market about 5 months later, moving out of Bramblewood Commons entirely. I don't know exactly where she landed, and honestly, I've thought less about her specifically in the time since than I expected to, mostly because the actual resolution that mattered most to me personally happened much sooner, on a Saturday about 2 weeks after that special meeting, when the new interim board formally rescinded the undocumented aesthetic enforcement policy entirely, replacing it with nothing more than the original sensible large flotation device restriction that had existed for years before Bernadette ever took office. Camilla got her flamingo float back that same weekend, retrieved from wherever it had been sitting in the HOA's storage closet, a little dusty but otherwise fine, and I remember standing at the edge of that community pool watching her climb back onto it, laughing, completely unaware of everything that had happened over the preceding weeks, to get that ridiculous, bright pink float back into her hands. If there's a lesson in this story, I think it's something Priyanka said to me on the drive home from that special meeting, the two of us still processing everything that had just unfolded. She said that people who build their authority around policing other people's aesthetic choices are very often, whether consciously or not, protecting some kind of personal interest hiding underneath the surface, a business, a brand, a version of themselves they're trying to sell, and that the moment you actually bother to look past the surface-level rule they're enforcing and ask what they might personally be getting out of it, the whole thing usually falls apart considerably faster than you'd expect. We looked, and it turns out that one confiscated flamingo float, one curious search on a rental listing website, and one very observant friend with a sharp eye for exactly this kind of thing were more than enough to prove that Bernadette Wexler-Holt's obsession with community aesthetics had never really been about the community at all. Thumbnail text: SHEBANNED MY float while renting hers.